After the surrender of Germany in April of 1945, VE Day, and of Japan in August, VJ Day, jubilant American military personnel expected to be sent home immediately, and many were. In what was called Operation Magic Carpet, some 8 million American soldiers and sailors returned home in hundreds of Liberty ships and Victory ships. Even aircraft carriers and battleships were pressed into service to transport war veterans back to the States from both Europe and the Pacific. Almost as quickly, hundreds and eventually thousands of U.S. Navy ships were taken out of commission and either mothballed or scrapped. It was almost breathtaking. On VJ Day, the U.S. Navy had nearly 7,000 warships on its active roster. A year later, there were barely 1,000. On the other hand, that was still 1,000 warships, far more than the Navy of any other nation, and 3 times the number that had been on the U.S. Navy list a decade earlier. For that matter, it's 3 times as many as the U.S. Navy has today, which is around 300. The main reason the Navy didn't endure further reductions was the almost immediate emergence of the Soviet Union as a threat in Europe and the onset of what was called the Cold War. Cold, because for the next 40 years, the United States and the Soviet Union never actually shot at each other, but still a war, because throughout that extended period, each perceived the other as an existential enemy, and both nations crafted their foreign policies and their military policies, including naval policy, accordingly. The U.S. Navy confronted other issues in the half-decade after the end of World War II, including defense unification and racial integration. But let's start with the Cold War. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union had been allies during the Second World War, or maybe it's more accurate to say that they had all fought on the same side against Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union did not join the war against Japan until 2 days after the Hiroshima blast, and even in the war against Germany, it had never been a true alliance. The Anglo-Americans had cooperated closely in the Mediterranean and during the D-Day invasion, while the Russians had fought their brutal war on the Eastern Front entirely on their own. The Anglo-Americans had supplied much of the equipment the Soviets used, but the fighting and the dying had been done by the Red Army. Stalin resented that. Indeed, the close cooperation of the British and Americans elsewhere contributed to his suspicion that the British and Americans deliberately delayed the D-Day invasion in order to ensure that the Red Army did most of the hard fighting in Europe, while American and British soldiers fought much smaller Axis armies in the Mediterranean. For their part, the Anglo-Americans, and especially British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, never trusted Stalin either. Their mutual suspicion was partly ideological. Stalin was a communist, after all. But it was also rooted in the fact that Stalin had partnered with Adolf Hitler in the invasion of Poland back in 1939, the event that had triggered the European War in the first place. 2 years later, in 1941, when Hitler had turned on his former partner, Churchill was willing to accept the Soviet Union as an ally. He famously said that if Hitler invaded hell, he would find a way to mention the devil favorably in the House of Commons. Nevertheless, over the next 2 years, the sacrifices of the Russian army and the Russian people convinced Stalin that the Soviet Union was owed. And it soon became clear what he thought the payoff should be. As the Allied armies approached Berlin, it became clear that Stalin intended to occupy and retain all the territory his armies overran en route to the German capital. That included Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and especially Poland. Indeed, it was the Polish issue that finally broke the alliance. Back in 1939, when Stalin had acquiesced in Hitler's invasion of Western Poland, he had also, by prearrangement, sent Soviet forces into Eastern Poland. Now, 6 years later, Stalin expected to keep not only the parts of Poland he had taken in 1939, he expected to keep the rest of the country too by establishing a puppet government in Warsaw. Churchill was furious and wanted to confront Stalin. But Roosevelt was reluctant to do so because he wanted a Russian commitment to join the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. After all, it was possible that even if the United States invaded homeland Japan, it would still be necessary to fight the million-man Japanese army in occupied China, and Russia's help in that would be extremely valuable. When Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at Yalta in the Crimea in February of 1945, instead of standing up to Stalin on the Polish question, as Churchill wanted to do, Roosevelt merely asked Stalin to go slow, hoping that it might be possible to postpone an open confrontation about Poland's future until after Japan was defeated. He also hoped that continued cooperation with the Soviets would make possible a post-war United Nations that could keep the peace in the future, as the League of Nations had failed to do after the First World War. By the time Russia did enter the war against Japan, the first atomic bomb had destroyed Hiroshima, and meanwhile Stalin consolidated his occupation of Poland. Churchill, who was no longer prime minister, famously declared that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. The Cold War had begun. Ideology was part of it, of course. Stalin was a communist, but what characterized his regime was not so much a Marxist concern for the well-being of workers and peasants, who were merely pawns and cannon fodder to Stalin, than it was an old-fashioned military dictatorship characterized by ruthlessness, ambition, and paranoia. So, while at one level the Cold War was a contest between capitalism and communism, at root it was a contest between freedom and tyranny, a struggle as old as the planet. For our purposes, there is another way to look at the Cold War, which is to think of it as a contest between land power and sea power. The Soviet Union then, and Russia today, was and is a land power, despite efforts by Peter the Great and others to give Russia a naval presence and open a window to the West. Britain, of course, was historically a sea power, and now, in the mid-20th century, so was the United States, which by war's end had become the greatest naval power in the world. If the Soviet Union had an enormous army, one that had beaten Hitler's Wehrmacht, the United States had an equally dominant navy. Franklin Roosevelt did not live to see the end of the war. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage in April of 1945, only weeks before the German surrender. As vice president, Harry Truman had been out of the loop for many of the Allies' wartime conferences, and he had to adjust quickly to the new circumstances. In so doing, he departed from a long-standing American tradition, one first articulated by George Washington in his farewell address. Washington had warned of entangling alliances, cautioning his fellow countrymen to stay out of European political squabbles. But in 1945, Truman and his advisors saw that withdrawing the United States from the European arena would leave the field open for Stalin's continued aggression in Europe. America's transformation from isolation to global involvement was especially evident in the year 1947. Britain had been providing military and economic aid to Greece to enable it to resist a communist insurgency. But in 1947, Britain was still digging out, quite literally in some cases, from the war's damage. Its government informed the Truman administration that Britain could no longer continue to prop up the Greeks. If the United States didn't want Greece to fall into the Soviet orbit, it would have to pick up the slack. To do that, Truman asked Congress for $400 million to aid both Greece and Turkey, historical enemies with one another, but both under the threat of communist takeover. Now, $400 million is not a huge amount of money today, but it was a pretty substantial sum in 1947. Even more importantly, it marked a decisive American turn away from its traditional isolationism. Moreover, Truman pledged that the United States would help not only Greece and Turkey, it would aid any nation seeking to defend itself from a communist takeover. This new outlook was almost immediately anointed the Truman Doctrine. 2 years later, in 1949, the United States made an even more sweeping commitment. It joined Britain, France, and several other countries in forming what was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which continues to play a key role in European security issues today. The whole idea of NATO was that if Stalin and the Soviet Union sought to expand further into Europe, the member states of NATO would stand together to stop him. American participation in NATO contrasted significantly from its rejection of the League of Nations in 1919. It also meant an expanded role for the U.S. Navy. In addition to defending the American coast and protecting the sea lanes, the traditional and historic role of the Navy, it now had to be prepared to respond to calls from threatened European allies. Those responsibilities grew again when, in that same year of 1949, the Chinese Nationalist Army of Chiang Kai-shek, America's wartime partner against Japan, was driven from mainland China by Chinese communists to the offshore island of Formosa, or Taiwan. So now, in addition to the Soviet threat in Europe, the United States had to keep an eye on the communist threat in Asia. In effect, the U.S. Navy assumed defense responsibilities for Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and Taiwan. Casting a shadow over all this was yet another key aspect of the emerging Cold War: the bomb. When World War II ended, the United States had been the only nation on Earth with nuclear weapons, and it had already proven that it was willing to use them. Stalin was keenly aware that this put the Soviet Union at a tremendous disadvantage, and he ordered Soviet scientists, including several captured German scientists, to embark on a crash course to acquire nuclear weapons. 4 years later, on August 29, 1949, the Russians exploded an atomic bomb in Kazakhstan. From that moment on, the possibility of a nuclear exchange overshadowed the Cold War era. All of this meant that American military planners, including Navy planners, worked hard to ensure that the United States maintained superiority in the number of atomic warheads it possessed, so that Stalin would not be tempted to use his own newly acquired nuclear weapons. The U.S. Navy also developed a carrier-based airplane that could carry an atomic bomb and an aircraft carrier big enough to launch it. The carrier was to be called the USS United States, not the first or the last to bear that name. The blueprints called for it to be more than 1,000 feet long and displace 80,000 tons. When fully equipped, it would be the largest aircraft carrier ever built. It would carry a fighter squadron for self-protection, but more importantly, it would also carry 12 to 18 long-range bombers to deliver nuclear warheads deep inside the Soviet Union. Here was the Navy's contribution to the new strategy of nuclear deterrence. The carrier was laid down in Newport News, Virginia in 1948. But it was never finished. To explain why, we have to look at another issue that dominated the post-war era, and that is defense unification. The Army, the Navy, the Marines, and the U.S. Army Air Forces had all worked together to achieve victory during World War II. Much like the Allies themselves, the individual services occasionally squabbled over strategy, command responsibility, resources, or priorities. These squabbles never seriously jeopardized operations, but there had been a number of occasions when it contributed to waste and delay. Another factor that influenced reform advocates were calls for the creation of an independent U.S. Air Force. The champions of strategic bombing had insisted for years that putting the control of air forces in the hands of Army generals or Navy admirals compromised the nation's ability to win wars by strategic bombing, that is, bombing an enemy's infrastructure rather than his military forces. These concerns contributed to the passage in 1947 of what was called the National Security Act, which created a Department of Defense. Previously, there had been a Secretary of War, representing the Army, and a Secretary of the Navy, each of whom had sat in the President's cabinet. Now, a single Secretary of Defense would represent both services, as well as a new and independent Air Force. Navy leaders were not happy about it. Large organizations are instinctively averse to big change, and there was lots of talk about how this was likely to be a threat to Navy traditions. There was also fear that naval aviation would fall under the control of the new Air Force, and what was to become of the Marines. In the end, the Navy kept control of Navy aviation, essentially of carrier warfare, and the Marine Corps, too, stayed within the Navy Department. The man chosen as the first Secretary of Defense was the sitting Navy Secretary, James V. Forrestal. Forrestal's tenure, however, was short. During the 1948 presidential campaign, Forrestal supported Harry Truman's opponent, Thomas E. Dewey. After Truman won the election, he replaced Forrestal with Lewis A. Johnson, who had been Truman's principal fundraiser during the campaign. It was not simply a political vendetta. Forrestal was also ill, suffering from depression. Not long after he left office, Forrestal died after he either fell or jumped from his 16th story room while being treated at Bethesda Naval Hospital. But Lewis Johnson turned out to be an unfortunate choice as Forrestal's replacement. For one thing, he was completely lacking in the kind of people skills needed to coordinate a big structural change without antagonizing the players. Here's an example. When Johnson flew to London to lay a wreath at a war memorial, he told the senior U.S. Navy officer there, Vice Admiral Richard Connolly, that the Navy is on the way out. Here's how he explained it to the Admiral. We'll never have any more amphibious operations, so that's the end of the Marine Corps. And the Air Force can do anything the Navy can do, so that's the end of the Navy. You can imagine how well that remark went down. The specific event that triggered an open revolt against Johnson was his cancellation of the carrier United States. He announced that he would use the money saved to fund a fleet of long-range Air Force bombers, the B-36. In his view, this sleek new bomber carrying atomic bombs would provide a sufficient deterrent for any future war. I wonder if any of you remember being on a playground in elementary school when a bully drew a line in the dirt and challenged you to step over it. I suspect this happened a lot more with boys than with girls. A typical response to this challenge was to put one toe over the line and say, in effect, okay, what are you going to do now? That is the essential problem with relying on massive retaliation as a defense policy. It offers little room for an interim step between complete peace and global thermonuclear war. What do you do if your enemy puts his toe over that metaphorical line in the dirt? The Navy's reaction to Johnson's announcement of this new policy has been known ever since as the Revolt of the Admirals. Some admirals were quite outspoken in testifying against the B-36 program, and a few, including the new Chief of Naval Operations, Louis Denfeld, were openly confrontational. To many in the Navy, this was simply a matter of speaking truth to power. But to others, it was a challenge to the principle of civilian control of the military. In any case, in the aftermath of the hearings, Denfeld lost his job, and others were either demoted or reassigned. In the end, the Truman administration successfully defended the principle of civilian control of the military, but the responsibility for nuclear deterrence was shared out among the several services. A key issue in a strategy of deterrence was, and remains, the survivability of nuclear weapons that could be used in a retaliatory strike. If deterrence was to work, the enemy, in this case the Soviet Union, had to believe that it would not be able to eliminate all of America's nuclear weapons with a preemptive strike. Airplanes on the ground, even missiles in silos, might be taken out by such a strike. But during the 1950s, the United States Navy developed a nuclear-powered submarine, the George Washington, that could fire missiles while submerged and do so from unpredictable locations. That gave the United States a retaliatory capability that could not be preemptively destroyed. No matter how many weapons the Soviets launched, American nuclear ballistic missile submarines would be able to respond. Here was effective deterrence against anyone but a madman. The guiding hand behind nuclear-powered submarines was a maverick naval officer named Hyman Rickover. Rickover was then and remains today a lightning rod for admirers and critics alike. Unquestionably brilliant, he was also abrasive and controlling. He insisted on exercising personal oversight over engineering programs and also insisted on selecting every officer who worked on the program. To test their suitability, he subjected them to often humiliating ordeals. He had 2 inches cut off the front legs of the chair in which candidates sat, so they would be uncomfortable while he grilled them. If he got an answer he didn't like, he might order the candidate to sit in a darkened closet for as long as several hours to reconsider his answer. However unorthodox, even mean-spirited that was, Rickover's drive and commitment produced astonishing results. He had overseen the construction and launch of the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, the Nautilus, in 1954, and only 5 years later, the missile-firing George Washington. By the 1960s, United States defense policy relied on what was called a nuclear triad that consisted of long-range bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, and the Navy's fleet of ballistic missile submarines. There was another revolution in the U.S. Navy of the 1950s. The United States had fought the Second World War with a segregated military. Non-white Americans had served in all branches of the armed forces, though in almost every case they were restricted to particular units or to particular assignments because of their race or heritage. Filipino Americans were expected to serve as officers' stewards. Japanese Americans served in segregated units and only in the European theater, where the famous 442nd Regimental Combat Team distinguished itself. Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, even Native Hawaiians all found themselves pigeonholed by prevailing American attitudes about race. Black Americans were particularly restricted. This was due to a near universal belief in the higher ranks of all the services, and for that matter in the country as a whole, that white soldiers would simply refuse to serve alongside Black Americans, and that any attempt to force them to do so would fatally undermine military efficiency. Consequently, blacks in the U.S. Army were not only segregated into separate units with white officers, they were also relegated to the most menial assignments. It was a bit different in the Navy. First of all, Black Americans had served in Navy ships since the days of John Paul Jones, and it was all but impossible to segregate white and black sailors on crowded warships, though at one point the Navy did experiment with having all black and all white crews, an experiment that did not last. Still, blacks in the Navy were generally restricted to the most menial tasks and ratings, especially as cooks and what were dismissively called mess boys. There were very few Black Navy officers and not a single Black Marine Corps officer. Black sailors were often used for stevedore work, loading and unloading ships. Occasionally, this had caused unrest, as it did in July of 1944, when black sailors at Port Chicago in California were loading ammunition for the Pacific War. The American invasion of Saipan was underway, and the supervising officers were in a hurry. In the midst of the frenzied loading, a massive explosion killed 320 sailors, most of them African Americans. After the debris field was cleaned up, the Navy ordered the black sailors back to work, loading ammunition. 258 of them refused, insisting on more safety protocols. The Navy interpreted that as refusal to obey a lawful order, which, to use the official term, was mutiny. 208 of the black sailors were court-martialed. 50 of them were found guilty of mutiny and sentenced to long prison terms at hard labor. It didn't come to that. Once the war was over, pressure from black advocacy groups, including the NAACP, led to a reconsideration. Eventually, the men were granted clemency. Yet the case highlighted the extent to which the Navy treated African Americans far differently from whites in terms of job assignments, discipline, and opportunities for advancement. This and thousands of other incidents contributed to President Truman's decision to sign Executive Order number 9981 on July 26, 1948. It declared, "There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." Truman initially asked Congress to pass legislation mandating equal opportunity in the armed forces, but a Southern filibuster killed it. And so he used his executive powers as commander-in-chief to order it. For the Navy, the half-decade after the end of World War II in 1945 was nearly as revolutionary as the war itself. The onset of the Cold War added new responsibilities for a global Navy. The advent of nuclear weapons added new platforms. The creation of a Department of Defense created a new environment, and an acknowledgement of the need for racial reforms helped redefine the post-war Navy. Almost at once, that Navy was called upon to fight in a new kind of war that broke out in Korea.